Hey, everybody. How's it going? Thank you for joining us. We're so glad to have everybody here today. We've got a good crowd going. Um, so I want to go ahead and reintroduce crisis response. If you've been here before, you probably know what I'm going to say, but if you haven't, just so you're aware of what we're trying to do here. So when the COVID-19 crisis broke out and everything ground to a screeching halt, I think all of us were acutely aware of the pain and the difficulty that businesses were being put through, large and small, as well as individuals. So what Max and I wanted to do was to provide a space and a platform for drawing on the wisdom of people that have experienced crisis before, people whose careers and companies were mature enough to provide a lot of wisdom for people as we navigate this crisis. So we have been just really overwhelmed with the response over the last few of these, and we're very, very pleased to have Ilana and Afshan here today with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and just let Max introduce himself and then let our panelists introduce themselves. So Max, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I am Max Pollock, the founder of Abstract Collective, and we're a full service firm that does marketing, design, and strategy services. I'm very excited to be collaborating with Trevor of Newberry Consulting to bring this webinar to you, along with our awesome guests, Ilana and Afshan.
Ilana?
Hi, I'm Ilana Diamond. I'm the Managing Director of Hardware, AlphaLab Gear, and Riverfront Ventures for Innovation Works. Innovation Works is an early stage investor, in fact, one of the most active early stage investors in the country. AlphaLab Gear is one of the first physical product accelerators in the United States, and Riverfront Ventures is a Series A investor in early stage tech companies. And I'm fortunate to get to work in all those different areas.
Cool. Afshan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Afshan Khan. I'm a portfolio executive in the hardware team with Ilana at Innovation Works. And we're excited to work with all kinds of physical product companies. My background is in manufacturing, and I led the manufacturing initiatives that Innovation Works had for several years before I moved over to the investment side. And it's really exciting to see all the different innovations and companies out there.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. Before we get kicked off into the questions, just to let everybody know, this is structured and run like a conversation. So we will be moving through some questions, but we also want to hear from you guys. So if, as we're going through this conversation, you have an idea or a thought or a question that you'd like to put forth, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're on this screen share, then you have updated your Zoom software because they cut everybody out yesterday. So feel free to use that Q&A function. You can submit that. We'll be monitoring that throughout the entire conversation. So with that, let's get started. So you've already introduced yourselves, but I want to know a little bit about your experiences with the previous crises that we've been through. I think most recent is the Great Recession from 2008. But anything else, we've had people that have talked about their experiences through the dot-com bubble and even earlier. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I can start. During the Great Recession, I was actually running a consumer electronics company. We were a consumer electronics accessory company, and our customers included people like Walmart and Best Buy and Circuit City and Target, and some of the, before Amazon was huge, but they were a customer, other online retailers. And it was really devastating to us, not just from the customer's perspective. We had customers who literally couldn't pay us, including some very big retailers who owed us a lot of money. And also from the supplier side, because we had suppliers in other countries, including in Asia. And I don't know if folks remember this, but during that time, factories went on break for Chinese New Year and just didn't come back. Nobody came back. And if that was your sole supplier, you were in trouble. The employees might come back and the factory door was locked because they couldn't pay their bills or whatever. So I think that I learned a lot from that. Number one was, if you've got a physical product company, you need a robust supply chain, and that means no single source suppliers for anything that's of any importance. It also made me aware of this whole idea of onshoring, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of that today in this latest crisis. The whole idea that if all of your manufacturing capability is thousands of miles away and you have very little control over it, you know, you've got a potential hole there. And so the idea of thinking about how you can manufacture closer to home and in the United States, hopefully, because you have more control over that. So I think a lot of the lessons that we learned then, I think we forgot in the last 15 years or so, and people went back to doing things the way we always did, and now we're learning those lessons again. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just building on what Ilana said, I ran a manufacturing company in building products. We had multiple sources of supply chain, both domestic and overseas in India and China. It was always a challenge from the standpoint of managing those supply chains, but as things went very crazy for us in the Great Recession, what was interesting to me was we sort of rode this huge roller coaster up. Housing starts numbers, I still remember 3.4 million at its peak in the housing boom before the crash. And for folks like us, unlike what's happened just recently, the crash was a little bit more gradual. We started to see our numbers decline. We started to experience slowdowns in our customer orders. And then it's funny how you can remember where you are at a certain point. I remember watching the news when the stock market crashed in September of 2008. So we were on a roller coaster. And the following year, there were less than 350,000 new home builds in the United States during that time. So even though we had multiple supply chains, I think Ilana's point about robustness is very evident. And as part of that, we had to manage the different cost structures of those different supply chains and multiple U.S. locations as well. So we had some adventurous times back in the Great Recession.
Yeah. How did you guys? What were some of the specific things that you and your companies that you were working with or for? What sort of immediate actions were taken? Ilana, I'll let you take the lead on that question.
So I think the first thing we did was try to really secure our customer relationships and try to really understand where they were coming from and what we could do to be helpful. One of the things that really can happen in a time like this, people remember, they have long memories. And if you are there for them and support them and help them during these times, you know, we really built on that in the 10 years that followed. You know, Best Buy and Circuit City, well, Circuit City isn't here anymore. They were actually the stronger one back then. But Best Buy had a lot of problems and, you know, they couldn't get people to ship them because if you didn't pay your bills, a lot of manufacturers didn't want to ship you. But if you were one of the folks who shipped them when nobody else would, they remembered that. And it's really a balancing act, right? Because if somebody's really going to go under, shipping them can put your company under too, right? But what we did was we took out account receivable insurance. And that turned out to be a lifesaver for us because it allowed us to ship more than we could afford to lose because we had insurance. Yes, it was expensive. Yes, it cut down on our profitability, but it allowed us to build relationships with our customers, and they did not forget that. And when things got better, the people who hadn't been willing to ship them were off the shelves, and the people who had got the business. So I think this is a time to listen to your customers and to see if you can be there for them without putting your own company at too much risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what Ilana experienced is similar also to what we experienced. One of the keys for us was building a very detailed cash flow analysis within our company to understand what was happening with our customers, what was happening with our payables. And one of the things that Ilana had mentioned also, now more than ever, the communication lines have to be open and pretty visible. It is so much better to be honest with both your customers and your suppliers to say, hey, look, I can only pay you a portion. I need more time. Here's where I am. And not to make any promises saying you're going to pay it all, in a short while, but rather to leave those communication lines open because, one, they're not going to waste time and energy taking legal action against you, which probably wouldn't do much good for anybody, except the lawyer, of course. And two, at the end of the day, they manage a relationship with you as well. And as Ilana said, if you have those communication lines open and you're being forthright, perhaps you're not being paid from your customers, or you're having supply chain issues in terms of delivery. That open communication is vital to maintaining and building that relationship. We found in a lot of cases, relationships on both with customers and suppliers actually got stronger during our hard times because they appreciated our honesty.
I want to completely agree with what Afshan just said, and just add one other thing. I think, your natural inclination, I remember my natural inclination was to not want to take that phone call because they're collecting money and you can't afford to pay them because you needed to pay somebody else, let's say. But I completely agree with Afshan about being straightforward. And what we found is when you said to a supplier, I can't pay you right now, but here's what I am going to do. And then you do what you say you're going to do. And if you can't do for any reason what you said you would do, you don't wait until the date that you promised to pay them. You call them ahead of time. What you're doing is you're building trust. And I say that's not only with your suppliers, that's true with your bank too.
Yep.
Hardware companies often have a banking relationship. And what bankers are really banking on is trust, is being able to believe you. And so if you call them and say, we have a problem and I want to tell you what we're going to do about it, they are far less likely to call in their loan than if they call you and have to sort of squeeze the information out of you. So I completely agree with Afshan about transparency and communication.
Absolutely. I think those are those are both just such excellent points that we have seen echoed throughout this series, and that I think Max and I have both seen bear fruit in our own efforts, is to be to focus on those relationships. What I wrote down here was focus on the relationships, analyze your cash flow really carefully, and be as open and honest and communicative as possible, which are not terribly difficult things, right? But they are not practices that when we're in like hyper growth mode, we tend to put a lot of effort into, or they can kind of get pushed to the side a little bit. So I'm so glad that you guys said that.
Or if we
I
get
want to
scared.
say what? What was that?
Or if we get scared, when you're in a stress mode, it's kind of like you want to hide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That defensive posture that people kind of find themselves in. Yeah. Well, the next question I got for you is, we know that crisis affects different industries different ways, but generally speaking, really capital intensive industries tend to be a little bit trickier when it comes to the cash crunch during a financial crisis. So what are you guys seeing right now with the companies that you're working with, and how are you advising them as they're moving through this crisis?
I'll start with that. That's a really good point, Trevor. One of the things that we're seeing is, we're seeing a whole range of things. We're seeing some folks who have taken swift action, and even though they weren't necessarily struggling when the crisis hit, they moved swiftly in anticipation of needing extra support, whether it was extra fundraising, whether it was shoring up their supply chain or finding alternative supply chains, can either laying off folks or actually retaining folks, but telling them, hey, why don't we, we have to weather this through. Why don't we all take pay cuts? Things like that. One of the things that Ilana has advised, I'm speaking for her, but is that you mull a lot of decisions in your head, And as you think about it, when a crisis or calamity hits, which usually is sort of swift, right? It's not necessarily. I mean, for us in the home building industry, it sort of came over time. But for everyone on the state of this globe, this is all hit in a very swift way. Everyone was in the middle of something in the entire world that got, immediately disrupted. So from that perspective, if you're thinking about and considering different plans of action, it's important to move swiftly. I can tell you lessons learned when I was sitting there watching that September 2008 crash and not necessarily having an idea first of how much it would impact our business. I regret not taking swifter action because it had an immediate, certain things that happened had an immediate drain on our cash flow that would have helped us not have to make tougher choices later.
That's good.
Yeah, I really agree with that, moving swiftly. And here's what I would say, which might help folks feel comfortable moving swiftly. First of all, I'll tell you something, not taking action is taking action. It's deciding to do whatever you did in the past, right? So I think one of the things that can help, that we recommend and that can help companies feel a little more comfortable about taking decisive action quickly is what we call scenario planning. So it's thinking through the different things that could happen. This is what we recommend to our companies, and sort of thinking through them at different levels. So if you were watching COVID in China in January, let's say, you could be thinking, well, if it comes here and we have sort of a slow shutdown, or if it comes here and all of a sudden the entire economy shuts down, if people aren't allowed to leave home, if you think through the things that could happen, especially the things that could impact your business, and you have in advance thought out what you could do and what's the best action, and you get a chance to talk to people about it. And so if you do that scenario planning as you see a crisis hit, then you feel more comfortable taking decisive action because you not only have a scenario that you're taking action based on, but you've also thought through, and what if it works the way we expected? What if it doesn't work the way we expected? What's our next step? So you sort of have those thoughts planned out, and you can feel a little more comfortable that even if what I'm suggesting doesn't work, I have a plan in place for what I'm going to do for it. And we found that the most successful companies are the ones that didn't just cross their fingers and hope nothing bad would happen. They were the ones who thought about the worst case possible things that could happen and planned for them. Yep.
I always say I would much rather be pleasantly surprised than unpleasantly surprised, right? Yeah. I think those are just excellent responses to that. I think that I wanted to follow up on the scenario planning. Is this something that you would, I would assume, but would you advise doing that on like maybe a quarterly basis, like even in normal times, even in times when things are a little bit more stable? Is that something that you find useful to do just as a check-in with companies on a somewhat regular basis? Maybe not every week, but say every quarter?
Even a little bit, in normal times, they're doing it more every year-ish.
Sure.
They're thinking longer term, and then they're updating it maybe every quarter. I think that does make sense. I mean, you always want to be thinking about what could happen, right? What could go wrong, and have a plan for if it goes wrong, especially with startups that are conditioned to try things quickly, get out there, get feedback, get information, and then pivot. That is essentially a scenario plan, I guess.
Yep, sure. So, one of the things that we keep hearing a lot about, and I think is just so true, is that in these environments, cash is king. The cash that you have on hand is going to be one of the determining factors as to how well you weather a crisis, how long you can hold on, and even how you emerge, right? How quickly and swiftly you're able to recoup some of your losses and make up lost ground. So we spoke a little bit about this already, Afshan, you've already spoken to this, but if there's anything to add to the concept of how can hardware companies specifically, being so capital intensive, how can they conserve cash, and how can they do that in a compassionate way? Sometimes cash conservation, too much austerity is not a good thing, right? So how can these companies be navigating that process in a compassionate way at the same time?
Well, Afshan did kind of allude to this whole issue of being transparent and honest with your suppliers and your customers. So both of them can help you with your cash, right? You can play your suppliers a little more slowly. That helps with your cash. But if you're honest and transparent, that's part of the compassion, right? And you can try to encourage your customers to pay you faster, and you can do that maybe with a discount,
Mm-hmm.
or offering them some other incentive. And I guess there's always the disincentive if we can't ship you until you pass for the last shipment. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of a last resort. I don't know. What did you do in the building industry, Afshan? That's what we did in consumer electronics.
It was, I think it was aligned, Ilana. I think, when we talk about communication and open communication, there's a lot of, there has to be an open communication with your employees too. You don't know necessarily what folks are willing to do. I think the love a person has, to use the term love, for what they do and the company they work with and the people they work with, they're willing to ride it out with you. And so what we found was our top management team, when things got quite tight, were willing to defer and not have it, permanently cut. I'll get to that in a second, but defer some of their compensation. I know some folks, including myself, and I think Ilana's in the same boat. Sometimes we took our paychecks, we purposefully made them not direct deposit and stuck them in a drawer for a little while. I remember undoing the direct deposit so I could stick them in a drawer and get to cash them later. But there's a lot of flexibilities. But this actually goes back to scenario planning. If you've worked out what your contingency plans are in different scenarios, then you can tell someone, hey, look, would you be willing to entertain, slower payments? Would you be willing to forego some compensation right now because I see this as our alternative plan that we're putting into place? And then one of the other things really quickly, for customers who are in a good position to pay, if you actually give them a discount, 2% terms, 10, net 30 kind of thing, even if you didn't have those terms in place ahead of time, if you offer those now because you need the cash in the door, sometimes they're willing to go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. That's really, really good stuff. I want to transition just a little bit here into a related subject, but sales. Sales is really tricky right now. So, what are your thoughts on sales and building pipelines in this environment? Is that something for some industries? I've heard people say we're pivoting completely away from sales and into relationship development. So we're not pitching anything; we're just trying to develop relationships. But for capital intensive businesses, cash flow is really, really dicey. So how are you advising the companies that you work with on building sales pipelines, filling sales pipelines, and just generally sales practices right now? Afshan, I'll let you start there. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, I'll start. Actually, Ilana had some really good ideas that we've already been advising our companies early on. But I would say that you have to take a step back and think about what value your customers need now. If you've got some good communications and relationships, and they are just getting to explore what your platform is in terms of a hardware platform, there can be slight pivots. I'll give you an example. We have a company in our portfolio who has been working with some larger Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies doing health-related tracking for folks in distribution and warehouses with, back strain and so forth. When COVID hit, they realized their platform could also provide employers to bring their employees back to work with symptom tracking in a safe, compliant way. So they've pivoted, and not only have they been able to raise funds around that, but they have a lot of interest because they already had those relationships, realized their customers needed something else right now, and were able to pivot slightly to deliver it.
I love that. Yeah. Ilana, anything from
I
you?
completely agree. The other thing that I'd add is, usually we tell our, at least early stage companies, that they really need to focus. They don't have the resources to pursue every single lead that comes their way. And in this time, we've been a little less, I think we've been a little less stringent about that piece of advice, because sometimes they just need to pay the bills. And that means thinking more broadly about what resources do we have, what skills do we have, what things do we have that can solve sort of hair on fire problems for our customers now. It may not be our long-term business. We may not do this at, post-COVID, but there's a need for it right now, and we can supply it. And I'll give you an example of that. We have a company that we invested in that makes modular housing, sort of housing that, like Lego, it grows as your needs grow. And construction was shut down, and so they couldn't, even though they had orders, they could not fill them. But they had all these people on staff that they didn't want to lose. They had interior designers, they had architects, they had folks like that. And they realized they had all these people are stuck at home in environments that maybe aren't ideal. So they started offering fixed price, we'll redesign your workspace for you and make it, more ergonomic, more comfortable, things like that.
I love that.
So we are encouraging companies to think a little more broadly during this time. You've got to pay the bills. So
yeah, it's almost, the not adage, but just the smart admonition for early stage companies about paying attention to where the pain is, right? It forces you to refocus a little bit, maybe back on that is what's the pain that I'd love that. I just wrote that down. What value do your customers need right now? What's that pain point that's really needling them right now, and how can you pivot to meet that? I love that. So I want to move to a couple of, just because we've got two people here, the last couple of questions I think we'll have time for, but how should hardware companies be preparing for a post-COVID world? Afshan, I want to let you take the lead on that, but I know you both have some deep thoughts on that. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yes, actually, I just want to go back to one more point on the other aspect. In terms of sales, also, that communication, especially with companies who are startups and they're working with larger companies who are not necessarily familiar with that technology. One of the things we found, and maybe this relates to the question you just asked as well, Trevor. I found this out serendipitously, that some of the companies in my portfolio, the one I gave you example about doing symptom tracking, has actually partnered with one of our other startups because they had a piece of the technology and the back-end development that these folks didn't. So they've worked out a deal where if they're able to take these initial pilots to full contracts, both benefit. So that's something to think about in terms of creativity. And some of your folks on the webinar may have networks of their own that they could think about in that way. And going to your question about a post-COVID world, to me, it's about rethinking all the processes that we are currently undergoing. And there are many, many ways to rethink processes for efficiency, for ease. We'll give an example. One of our companies was able to make their product essentially installable by their customers. They sell B2B, and they were able to make everything using video and some augmented reality to create dip simple systems, so they don't have to go out to remote sites and install, and they can use the same tools to troubleshoot. So that's an example of a process for a hardware company that should reduce the cost and the resources involved with launching and deploying your product. The other thing to think about, one of the companies in our portfolio was working on some hardware products and software products in the life science space. And again, they realized that they couldn't get in to do the pilots that they were working on because of the shutdowns with research and academia. So they found an amazing renewed interest and growing demand for some of their software platform to help customers manage things more remotely. So that's another example of, a company may have a hardware and software combination of offerings. Sometimes the software could perhaps take on a greater role.
Excellent.
I guess I would add to that. There's a quote that I love about in times of change, learners inherit the earth, and the learned are left with, they're equipped to deal with the world that no longer exists. And so I feel like early stage companies are the ultimate learners. On the one hand, hardware companies maybe have a little more infrastructure than a software company might, maybe more physical infrastructure that they had to pay for. And yet an early stage hardware company has way less than a later stage hardware company.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a chance to make change. And it's a little less painful because they have less investment. I think many times if you've invested a lot of money and effort and time in something, it's hard to let go of it, even if that's the right decision. And I think as we approach the post-COVID world, companies should be thinking about what things have changed permanently, and what changes can I make in processes, as Afshan pointed out, but in other areas as well. For example, here's another example of a company we had that was selling their educational technology product to school districts. Well, school districts are closed, and who knows if they're, and they also sold to camps over the summer. Camps are closed. Who knows if school will be the same in the autumn? They developed a way to sell this to parents who had a pain at home today, right now, needing to homeschool. That may be a whole new market for them. Maybe that will be their entire new market. They could make that change because they were early stage. If you have smaller revenues and a smaller infrastructure, you can change it to adapt. So I guess what I'd say is that post-COVID, people should be thinking about their customers, their product, their business model, how they make money and collect money. Every aspect of their business, they should be thinking about what aspects have changed temporarily and what aspects have changed permanently, and not be afraid to make a decision, to pivot.
One thing that brought up that I wanted to jump in with is what you just referenced, really the difference between early stage and more mature companies being flexibility, right? Being the ability to maneuver. And real quick, because I know we had one more we want to get to, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on, both of your thoughts on how mature companies can build in that level of flexibility, can maintain that without becoming too, ossified, if you will, and unable to flex during these times.
Well, one thing I'd say is partnerships with early stage companies, and that's what we see a lot of. A lot of large corporations in Pittsburgh, where we're located, have reached out and want to work with the early stage companies as a way of maintaining innovativeness. They put people on their teams to help them. That's great for those early stage company. It's also great for the later stage company. Sometimes, at one time, the CEO of a very large multinational came to hear some pitches from some of our companies. And none of these companies had gotten more than $100,000 in funding, and none of them was more than a year or two old. And when he heard the progress they'd made, he was just shocked. He said, for us to have done this, it would have taken millions of dollars and tens of years to make that progress. So, he sort of resolved at that point to keep an eye on these startups. And he said, if somebody else is doing it and has done it for $100,000 and in 2 years, we can acquire them once we see that it works. And that was their way of sort of maintaining agility, but still maintaining the processes and the perspective that they've developed as a larger corporation, and not just throwing it all away.
I love that.
So I would agree with Ilana, that the companies are pretty amazed at what startups can do. I think that in general, larger companies tend to take swifter action by laying off folks. Smaller companies like startups and early stage can't really afford to sort of, reduce their team of 5 to team of 2. So they have to be more creative in terms of conserving cash and weathering the storm. I think that companies that are larger, however, even though they might rethink some of their processes, they don't necessarily want to engage in something that innovative in a time of crisis, but they do want to be in touch with and connected with those companies, as we said earlier, that are solving their immediate problems now, and those relationships can build in these times of challenge.
Yep. Excellent. Excellent. So last question real quick. And I've asked everybody that we've had on this webinar this, because I think it's so important is, we've got a bunch of people on this webinar, and some people have been lucky and they've done okay, and some may not have. They may be struggling. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of pain right now that people are experiencing because of COVID and other things that are happening in our world right now. So I wanted to know just what kind of advice and insight do you have for these folks as two people who have had careers that have seen crises and unrest? What can you tell the folks that are on our webinar to give them some hope for moving forward and best practices for moving forward?
Do you want to go first? Me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll give you something that I personally learned from crises and that I really believe in. You can't do everything well every day. You just can't. So in my case, be the perfect mother, the perfect friend, the perfect CEO, the perfect wife, the perfect everything. You just can't. So you have to pick every day one or maybe at most two things that you're going to do well and let yourself off the hook on all the other ones. Because in a time of crisis, all those needs, all those roles, they all seem like they're critical. And there's a lot of value to thinking what is truly critical today. What do I really need to do right today? And do that one thing really well, and then pat yourself on the back and let yourself off the hook for the other things. You will still wake up tomorrow alive, regardless of whether you do, fulfill every role perfectly. I think a lot of us who lead companies are perfectionists and we want to do everything perfectly, but I think it can really weigh on you, and it can get in your way. That angst can get in your way of doing any of the roles well, especially during a crisis.
I think that was extremely well said. I would agree. I know I get all worked up with trying to be perfect in all areas all the time. But, with every crisis, there's an opportunity as well. And I feel like we've talked about this, Ilana and I, with our companies. Some of the best companies that we're all very familiar with now sort of rose in a time of crisis. So don't be afraid in terms of just going out there and taking some risks that maybe you were holding back on, albeit reasonable in terms of what the demand out there in the market is now. And I would say, similar to what Trevor and Max are doing here, in this time of crisis, folks are willing to, folks you don't know are willing to reach out and talk to you, share advice, make some suggestions. I would try to maximize reaching within my network and outside my network if you do plan to pursue something pretty bold. I think now might be the time that you might have more people to listen, give advice for, and possibly funding and support as well.
Excellent. That is excellent advice. This has been fantastic. I just want to thank you both so much for your time and your insight and the wisdom that you have been so generous with sharing today. We've got one question. Max, I'm going to turn it over to Max to handle the Q&A portion of this. If you have a question, feel free to jump into the Q&A section. We've got one we're going to tackle right now, and we'll see if any pop up. But otherwise, Max, take it away.
Awesome. So the question that we have from one of our live attendees is, as a hardware company, we've had to think about and shift a lot to virtual environments replacing physical environments, aka this conference call. Which physical environments, whether that's work, home, schools, etc., do you think people will be more likely to invest in as we move forward, and how do you envision this change happening?
Do you want to answer, or do you want?
Oh, do you want to tackle it first and then I'll jump in?
Sure, sure. So I'm going to answer sort of the reverse of that, if you don't mind, but it does kind of answer the question. And I'm going to answer which areas do I think people will not invest in. And I feel there are two areas that have changed permanently for the worse, likely. One is commercial real estate. I think people have gotten used to working at home. They've realized it's not the end of the world. They've gone out and created environments that allow them to work at home and purchase technology. And if you think about how much money companies spent on real estate and how much they could save by not doing that, I think commercial real estate is going to be a real issue. And it's going to be difficult. And related to that is location-based retail. I think location-based retail was on a slide to begin with, other than, somebody pointed this out to me today, other than entertainment retail. So where, you're going for fun. But I think those are two areas where we're not going to see as much investment. And I think co-working, maybe this does answer your question, since a lot of large companies won't want to have as much commercial real estate, they might have more shared real estate, more co-working kind of real estate. So that might be something that will benefit.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think we haven't begun to see the tip of the iceberg impact on commercial real estate. I think it's going to be quite dramatic. So from the question, which is a terrific question, I think our home environments with technology, with easy living spaces and working spaces, spaces that can do double time, but at the same time, if you're having an internal meeting and your kid runs across the back of it and starts to scream or something, it doesn't really matter. But if you're having a formal meeting, folks may want to create a special Zoom background or something so that doesn't create a disruption. One of the things, I think this is a strange thing to say, but in a strange way, Zooming all the time has made us a little bit more human. I know that's a weird thing to say, but Ilana and I were on a call with one of our portfolio companies, and his 3-year-old daughter had to come in to say goodbye because she was going out, and we were all fine with that. And it's humanizing in a way to see our pets and to see where we live and how we live, and realize that there's a lot of commonality among all of us. And so in some ways, I think that makes the home environment even more valuable to us, especially since we've been in it for so long in the last couple months.
Locked in.
Definitely. And those are both great responses. I also had another question from a consumer product company, and they were curious if they should think about postponing their product launch, and if so, what kind of factors, whether it's in the market or in the economy, should they look for when they're thinking about when to reschedule their product launch?
So the question on that, can they share what kind of a product it is or what space? That makes a big difference, because we've seen consumer products sometimes take off in this environment as well.
Yeah, so they are in not the hardware space, they're a card game. So they're trying to figure out whether now is the time to launch or if they should postpone and wait because of COVID and maybe people not having expendable income.
If there's my thinking is, and Ilana, please jump in, if there's a seasonality to what they expect should happen with the launch of their new products, it might make a little sense to wait. If it doesn't create a big cash crunch for them or cause a disruption in their supply chain. Thinking of the seasonality, regardless of what happens right now, folks will probably want to, increase their spending toward the holidays, toward the fall, so that they would want to engage in newer ideas then. That's a thought.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that I don't know with toys and games when the launch time is for purchasing for the fall. So if they were going to go through retail, a lot of times those decisions are made July and ship in August. So they may need to launch even if they don't intend to really ship until Christmas time. But the other thing that I was just going to ask him was, is there a way to make this game something that you could play online? Because I can tell you that everybody I know is playing games online with their friends and with their family and with other families. And it's a way of socializing, having something to do. And on some games it works really well, and on others it's less successful. And I personally have a group that we have once a week play a game every Thursday night. And there are some games where they even just get the little things right. And so when somebody joins the game, you hear a door opening, and they have different sound effects and so on. And we can Zoom while we play the game. So the Zooming is in a small part of your screen, and you can be chatting, but you're still playing. So if they could think through how their game would make sense in an online plus offline version, I would think that would be a big strength for them.
Awesome. Thank you for both for that. I have another question from a live attendee. So this is good because both of you have experience as business operators. Raymond is asking, how are CEOs and entrepreneurs preparing to preserve their leadership, their culture, with their workforce transitioning to either completely virtual or remote, or kind of a hybrid of some on-site and some remote?
Okay, so I'd like to give an example. I think that's a great question. And I'll use our CEO as an example. With the tragedies that have happened with the recent deaths with George Floyd and others. I say others because the young woman in Atlanta, I was particularly just heartbroken about. And that was sort of quiet from a news perspective. But you know, as things have escalated, Innovation Works has been focused on equality and racial diversity, and a balance for all people in our staff. So our CEO has reached out to have a virtual lunch tomorrow, I believe, to discuss this matter, to let folks speak their mind about their concerns, about their fears, about their frustrations. And he is working to engage the fact that he too is particularly saddened by all of this and disgusted by we're all disgusted by it. And so in a way, even reaching out virtually to have an open forum of discussion that is a safe space is one way to still connect with folks. We also have, as Ilana mentioned, a cohort kicking off soon for our Alpha Lab gear, actually later on this afternoon. And we're doing icebreakers virtually, so we'll get to know each other with our new cohort of companies through icebreakers played virtually. So I think it's a really good question, and I honestly feel that different than a photo opportunity, when we're even on a webinar like this for almost an hour, you have to develop and cultivate how your leadership and your culture will continue. And it's not a photo op. It's real, even if it's on the screen.
Yeah, I think it takes, you're absolutely right, Afshan. It takes intentionality. So it's so easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day. And normally when you're in an office environment, you run into people and you just chat. And so you have to intentionally make opportunities for that. For example, another thing that our organization organized was weekly lunches, where you can just drop in and drop out. And the only rule is you're not supposed to talk about work, although every once in a while we break that rule, but we try not to. So, people showed up in funny hats, people, we just chat, get to know each other. People have posed a question and everybody answers it. I think you have to make an effort to have those interactions happen, because otherwise everybody's off in their own little silo, and you can lose the culture you've built and you can lose those relationships. So I completely agree with Afshan.
Awesome. Thank you both for the answer to that question. I'll pass it back over to Trevor for the webinar wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Those questions were great, and especially huge thanks to Ilana and Afshan for being here. This has been a great conversation. I have loved doing the series. As you pointed out, this crisis has provided some opportunities to connect with people that I personally would not have ever connected with. So I'm very thankful for that and grateful for your time. So I wanted to give you both an opportunity. We like to make sure that you have an opportunity to tell people about what you're doing. If there's something that you'd like to let people know about on your end with the work that you guys are doing.
I'm going to jump in real quickly. Being involved with hardware investments, we try to have similar chats like this and share information. So if anybody wants to go on our website, innovationworks.org, we have some really good blogs around hardware, around investment strategy, around networking, and so forth, and good resources for folks that are sort of real resources that anyone can apply in their business.
And I would add, if you look at those resources and you see somebody online that you think, oh, I would really like to talk to that person. This is one of the advantages now of the Zoom economy. We all are doing all of our office hours by Zoom. We all have a calendar that you can, I think the calendar's on our website, but worst case, you see our email, reach out by email and ask somebody for a link to their office hours calendar. And you can have a Zoom chat with anybody, whether it's you want expertise in manufacturing, or you want expertise in marketing, or public relations, communications, hardware, software, life science. If you see a program that you think might be useful for your company or a friend's company, reach out to the person in charge of it, sign up for office hours, and have a Zoom chat and learn more.
I love that. I love that. I just realized that I didn't introduce myself at the top of this, which I normally do. So I forgot about that part. One of my coworkers is on this and she'll probably scold me for that later. So my name's Trevor Newberry, and my company, Newberry Consulting, we're doing a story mapping session. So we work mostly with software startups, but we have worked with a number of people from food and beverage through products. But basically we use story as a way to understand the steps that your customers need to go through and the process of building the features for your product. So we're doing that for free. We're just trying to make connections with people and be as helpful as possible. So if you've got a big idea, you want to get it off the ground, a good place to start is with some brainstorming and telling yourself a story about your customer and how they're going to use your product or service. So reach out to me, Trevor at newberryconsulting.com, if you're interested in doing that. Max?
Awesome. And the one thing that I'm offering is with everything going on, we're doing digital presence audits to be able to assess where your website is, your social media, other digital strategies, because as people are not going to brick and mortar stores or retail stores right now, and they're in lockdown or social distancing, it's more important to make sure that everything from your digital presence is firing on all cylinders and you're able to best engage and interact with your customers. So if you're interested in that, we're doing up to 3 businesses at random for free for that. Just reach out to me, and that'll also be included in a follow-up email. With that follow-up email, we'll have the recording for this webinar and some additional resources. And while I'm talking, I'll also share our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, June 17th, with Dave Gray, who was the founder behind, or the CEO behind Daxco. And that'll be focused on software as a service business models, again, within the theme of crisis response. With that, I'll pass it back to Trevor just to wrap things up in our final minute.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much. Everybody here, this has been a great time. Like I said, these webinars have just provided so many great opportunities to connect with people around the country. Ilana, Afshan, Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't say it enough. I know I've said it a bunch, and I'll continue to say it a bunch. That being said, again, you will get an email. We are also going to post this on a YouTube feed and then the Dispatch podcast feed. So the audio will be available there. The video will be available on the YouTube feed. All of those will be linked in the email that you get. And with that, this has been the third edition of Crisis Response. Thank you to everyone involved and for helping make this happen. Hope you guys are all able to stay safe and healthy, and that you guys have a good rest of the week. So thank you so much.
Thank you.